Okay, so the first thing that we want to do here is actually go into our directory where our code is. And we can just do that in our console by cding into defi-staking-app. Now, once we're in the actual folder, we can actually launch it up in our text editors by typing in the name of our text editor or whatever the shortcut for that would be, followed by a period, followed by a period. So the period will open up the entire, all of the code specifically to that. So I'm using Visual Studio Code. So for that, all I have to do really is type in code, space, and then period. Now, if you have Sublime, for example, or depending what it is, you can just go to the website. And Sublime is another text editor that's very popular, but you could just go to their website and try to look to see what the shortcut commands could be for a console or for loading it up through your console like that. So I'll hit enter, and here we go. So now we see we actually have our I have my Visual Studio Code open, and you'll have whatever text editing coding software that you use opened as well, hopefully. And let me just make sure. Okay, and so once we open it up, we're not going to see that much to start, right? So we can take a look on the left side and we can see everything that we have. And you're going to also want to make sure that you have Solidity as an extension so that it can be recognized, because we are going to be writing Solidity files, of course. So to do that, we have to go into our extensions, and then we have to search for the extension and then install the extension. So if you search for Solidity and you don't see it, then you want to add it. And we want to add it. So you want to add the Solidity, Ethereum Solidity language. Okay, and now this is on the left side here where my mouse is. Essentially in Visual Studio Code is where we can see our entire file directory and the makeup. So we've opened up our file, and we're going to see that there's not much to start with, but don't worry, we are going to be building these smart contracts out together along with the front end and the configuration for the back end with Truffle. Okay, so but what you should see from the file is you should see an empty migration folder. We should see our React public folder, which includes the index HTML. And then we should see our source folder. And in our source folder, we're going to have another empty folder components, an empty folder contracts, and then some images. So we've got our digital bank image, and then our source folder, and then we see we have our components, and we see we have a components folder, and then we have a contracts folder underneath that, and then we have some images, some PNGs that we're going to be using. So we have our digital bank PNG, we have our Ethereum logo, we have another logo. Oh, sorry, that was a little bit small, but here we can zoom in. All right, maybe not the greatest resolution, but you get the idea. And of course, we have our tether PNG as well over here, because we are, of course, going to be using a mock tether. Since we're going to be using mock tether for our staking together, tether together. All right. And we have a token logo as well. Now, actually, the first thing I like to do, especially if you're doing full stack development, or you're building a project serverless and you're really building the front end and the back end yourself or with a small team, is to really conceptualize from the get-go, not just the stack that you're going to use and the conceptualizations of the ideas, but the architecture. And a very basic way to do this, this may seem simple enough, this may seem a little bit deceivingly simple, but really it's important to have these folders laid out. So let's just talk about this for a second and think about the architecture for our code, how we want to be compartmentalizing our code out, where we're placing the different forms of logic, because remember, this is a bit more multi-complex than just building a serverless application, right? Because we are leveraging blockchain. So we have to think about, where do we want to keep our business logic? Where do we want to keep our component logic? Where do we want to keep our state for React? And all these things, of course, if you're unfamiliar with these terms, we are going to be going through them again together and trying to really lay this out. So don't worry if you're not so sure when we talk about state. So our migrations folder is going to be where we will be building it's where we're going to be deploying our contracts. It's essentially building the logic in order to deploy our contracts. Now, why is it called migrations? Well, it's important when we're running a test development environment to have a migrations folder set up so that we can actually update our blockchain environment status. So we have to bear in mind that when it comes to blockchain, when we put something up, like when we're actually putting it up on the main net, whenever our smart contracts go up, it's done. It's up there on the blockchain, and that transaction is completed. The smart contract is up there. We can't actually go into that smart contract itself and start changing things on the Ethereum blockchain. Okay, but what we can do, so does that mean, therefore, that we can never make changes to our smart contracts? Well, in some sense, yes, but in another sense, no. That's why we can leverage migrations, because you can actually look at the blockchain and think of it in terms of transactions that are changing. Therefore, the state of the blockchain is changing in itself. So that's why we consider creating these migrations, so that as we run our tests, we need to constantly be developing our smart contract, right? Like we're adding functions, we're changing functionality to it, we're changing the logic, we're building the logic out. We don't know exactly how things are going to turn out or exactly where we're evolving from the get-go. So that's why we have a system set up so that we can migrate. And what we do when we migrate essentially is we update the status, where we create new addresses for our newly updated or our updated and developed contracts, smart contracts, and then we send our transactions, and then we set our application to those new addresses. That's effectively what we are doing. Now, if that doesn't make any sense, don't worry, because we're going to see this together as we develop our yield farming application together, because we're using multiple smart contracts, and we're going to see not only how they work by themselves, but how they actually integrate with each other as well. So to recap, our migrations folder is where we will be storing the code to deploy and update our smart contracts. Now in our source folder, we have our components, and this is a very standard React system setup where you want to have a folder for your components. Now, what are your components? Your components are essentially the different functional aspects of your application. So a nav bar, for example, we're going to be building out a nav bar, something as basic as that, a form, that does something, the timer for our airdrop. These are all components, and how we want to compartmentalize our components and build them out is really important to think about too, because it helps us to be organized, and it helps us for working in team environments as well, so that when there are issues with our code or updates, it's easy to kind of move from one point to another thing, and we don't get these massive, long, confusing JavaScript files of code, but instead we have these nicely written out components which we can then also use multiple times over and over, and that becomes very powerful too, right? Because if we have a timer, for example, if we build an amazing timer component for our airdrop, then that component is done, that logic is done, and we can reuse that for multiple different things, which is really powerful when it comes to more advanced JavaScript. Okay, so the components are where we're going to be building out the functionality for our applications. And then the contracts file under here is where we're going to be building our smart contracts. So we're going to be creating a smart contract for our tether, for our USDT. That tether, of course, doesn't exist right now. So we need to set how many tokens it contains, the supply. We need to set up the functionality. So, we have to remember that. So it's important that we want our users and our customers to be able to approve their transactions. So we have a measure of security. So we put all that kind of functionality in there. The transferring of funds, the transferring of tokens, that's going to go into our contracts, as well as our yield farming contract, which we're going to be building out together as well. Okay, so our contracts go in our contracts. So our contracts go in our contracts file, and that makes a lot of sense. We have our images, which we will leverage when we're building out our front end. And then we have our git ignore, which is for when we put stuff up on GitHub, and we can just ignore that for now. We have our Babel. Okay, but let's take a look at our package JSON together. So when we open up the package JSON file, we see that we have basically our dependencies, and let's go over the dependencies together. We understand what libraries and frameworks are key in order for us to build this and get a head start, so we're not reinventing the wheel here. So essentially we have the name set up over here, DeFi tutorial, DeFi token staking app with description. You put the offer here, and then we have our dependencies. So we see that we are using Web3. Okay, so we see we have our web3.js, and that's basically what we're going to be using in order to interact with our MetaMask, to interact with our Ethereum nodes so that we can run these transactions, as we're going to see. We're using some TypeScript for one of the libraries that we have. So we have our TypeScript installed. We see that we have Truffle, which we use, of course, for all of our blockchain implementations, for deploying our contracts, our migrations, for tests as well. We have Solidity here. We have the latest version of Solidity. Then for our front end, just to be, just to have a little bit of UI, make it a little bit fun, we have our particles set up over here so that we can leverage this library to build a nice little, build some modern animation in the background. We have our React scripts so we can run. And then for a little bit of design additions, we have Bootstrap set up as well. And then we have Chai for our testing, which we're going to see when we're going to be building out our testing to make sure that everything is up and running with our contracts correctly. Okay, and if we just browse down, we see our scripts here. So we can run start, npm run start to test our development servers. All right, and then finally what we want to do is go back to our terminal, and we want to install our dependencies, install our npm dependencies. And in order to do that, it's as simple as typing in npm install or npm I and hitting enter. And it's now, and when we do this, npm is going to run through all the dependencies. As we can see, it's running through all the dependencies. It's running through all these, and it's installing everything we need into a very large file of texts, so that we can leverage these libraries and use them, and it's not just a script that doesn't actually fetch anything. Okay, and so once you have installed everything, you're going to see that we have Truffle installed here. We have Solidity. We have our Solidity. We see everything. And it says that we've installed 2635 packages from 1093 contributors. Wow. And 56 of these packages are looking for funding. So if you want to help out some of these great libraries that exist, you can always type in npm fund and learn more about how you can help these coders out there that are making our lives easier. Okay, great job setting up your dependencies, getting this project, getting it going. Now that we have our project set up, we've gone over some basic architecture, we can actually get into building what it takes to set up our smart contracts. Great work, and I'll see you in the next video.